So our third speaker is Kristel Schoonderwoerd. Have I pronounced that correctly?
Very close, yes.
Close. Who is a new member of staff here at Edgehill. She's a lecturer in plant science and botany, working on the morphology of winter buds and overwintering strategies of temperate trees. And her talk is called Hidden in Plain Sight, the Value of Simply Observing in Botany. Okay, over to Kristel. Let me just try.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. This is number 3, which is number 3.
It's that one, yes.
Yeah, there we go. And there it is, there's a little icon, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honour to be speaking here to you today as a complete newcomer to the BSBI and to the UK as well after 10 years in the States. My name is Kristel and I'm a new staff member at Edgehill. And I'm a morphologist, and I'd like to take the next 15 minutes or so to tell you a little bit about what being a morphologist means to me. 12 years ago, I was a master's student on international exchange, and I found myself in the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, face to face with an extinct plant. And by extinct, I mean extinct in the wild. The plant was Franklininia altamaha, the Franklin tree, and it was last seen in its natural habitat in 1803 in Georgia. But thanks to the work of the American naturalist William Bartram, who collected the seeds and propagated the species, it's still with us today. Unusually for a temperate tree, Franklininia flowers in the autumn, and then it matures its fruits over the next growing season, so it takes a full year from flower to fruit. And I set out to understand what it means for seed development to have such an unusual cycle. And I found out that while fertilization happens immediately after pollination, the zygote overwinters in the seed as just a single cell, quite miraculously. And the first division leading to the embryo doesn't happen until May of the next year. So during the winter, it just sits there for quite a few months. Now, what really captivated me about doing that project is to discover that it is still possible to discover something new just by looking at it, even in a species that's so charismatic and has been in the public eye for such a long time. So that was my first introduction to plant morphology, the study dedicated to plant form, and I was so hooked that I spent the next 10 years first studying winter bud development through a morphological lens, and most recently sun and shade leaf morphology in oak trees. Now, with that initiation to plant morphology came the introduction to an interesting dichotomy in the perspective on doing plant science. You see, we morphologists, we like to believe that morphology sits at the very center of plant science. It's the thing that glues all of the other subfields together. And we worry a lot and we talk a lot about if scientific studies place too much emphasis on state-of-the-art modern techniques and they forget to look at actual plants, that a really important piece is lost. Without morphology, genomic papers are just about gene names. Without morphology, remote sensing studies are just pixels. And large comparative studies of functional traits risk reducing entire niches to just a single number. So at first I assumed this tension between technology and carefully observing plants was distinctly modern, something for the fast-paced age of high-throughput sequencing and computational power. But over the years, as my library's sort of grown a bit and the filing cabinets filled out, I noticed something interesting. This dichotomy has been around for quite a while. So the anthropologist Lauren Isley in 1957 wrote an essay called The Enchanted Glass, in which he describes how we've sort of become accustomed to preserving two streams of thought in Western biology. On the one hand, he identifies what he calls the Baconian biologist, and this type of biologist, and I'll use Isley's own words here, is apt to find himself more and more removed from visible nature and its emotional connotations until he has literally dissolved them away into fields of force, warps in space, and other abstractions. And Isley contrasts that archetype with another type of naturalist, someone who he calls the old-fashioned contemplative naturalist. And note the word old-fashioned here, that's very important. He says the old-fashioned naturalist is telling an essentially personal story, and the recounting of such descriptive episodes may by some be scorned as trivial and unimportant. But the naturalist themselves believes that they contain fragments of natural history so vast, shifting, and impermanent as to confound the strict empiricist. So with that in mind, let's have a look at what some famous botanists have said on the topic. Catherine Esau, known for her work on phloem anatomy and textbook in her autobiography in 1991, remarked that the approach to teaching botany has changed greatly in the last few years. The present emphasis is on biochemical and molecular approaches, and the trend leaves little time for studying the plant as a whole. American botanist Barry Tomlinson wrote an essay entitled The Good Eye in 1964, in which he says, too often the research worker assumes that modern machinery will do the research for him. He may even develop the lamentable attitude that without costly instruments, no research is possible, assuming that all the progress that can be made without them has already been accomplished by 19th century biologists. Agnes Arber in the 50s wrote quite extensively on the topic. And Willem Troll in 1931, in one of the first morphological textbooks, wrote that the ability to make visual or intuitive observation has indeed been lost to an alarming extent. Indeed, the eye has been displaced from its dominant position in favor of merely measuring and registering. And interestingly, Troll has it out for the microscopes. He's really worried that the introduction of the microscope is causing us all to start measuring and counting cells instead of looking at the plant. Going back even a century further, to 1860, Henry David Thoreau of Waldenthame wrote in his personal notebook that some of the early botanists were prompted and compelled to describe their plants, but most nowadays only measure them. The former is affected by what he sees, and so inspired to portray it. The latter merely fills out a schedule prepared for him. Very few indeed write as if they had seen the thing which they pretend to describe. Goethe, the famous German poet, also a very keen botanist, felt the same way about microscopes as Troll did. And finally, Tomlinson's essay titled The Good Eye comes from The Anatomy of Plants by Nehemiah Grew in 1680, in which he writes that to observe plants, you just need a good eye, a clear light, and a razor wherewith to cut. You get my point. There is a long tradition of botanists worrying about the loss of careful observation for a long, long time. And yet, here we are today, a big room full of people who are keenly and deeply interested in looking very closely at plants. So that is good news. Clearly, the quote-unquote old-fashioned naturalist has survived the introduction of the microscope and of genomics. So I'm very hopeful that we will survive TikTok and AI and remote sensing as well. But I think the good news comes with a footnote, and that is, it's perhaps because careful observation has survived, because these botanists have championed it, because they have bothered to write about it and spread the word. So I suspect it's up to us to continue spreading that message, and that is why I think it's worth spending a few minutes once in a while, like today, to really articulate the importance of attentive observation. But I want to make one important adjustment. I don't think that a challenge really is modern technology. I think we might simply be up against the word simply in the phrase simply observing. We are continually up against the notion that observing is easy. It's something that we do every day, something that requires no training. We all look around ourselves and we observe things, right? But just because you've looked at something doesn't mean that you've seen it or truly understood it. So think of the beginner botanist who must consult a dense text full of complicated descriptions to be able to identify a species. And then think of the practice botanist, the experienced botanist, who is instantly able to know what a species is without being able to even be able to recount what the book used to say. And when you ask them, how do you know it's that? They might say something vague like, oh, it's Gestalt, or I don't know, it's just that species. I've seen it before. So that tells us two things. First of all, observation is really hard. And secondly, observation can be learned given enough patience and time. So what do we know about that process? What does it take to get from there to there? Well, most of what we know about how it works comes from the fields of art history and education. And in those contexts, you might see it referred to as slow looking, which is simply defined as taking the time to observe more than meets the eye at first glance and moving beyond the first impression into a deeper, more immersive experience. The term is perhaps slightly deceptive. Looking doesn't necessarily mean visual perception, it can mean any kind of observation. And slow doesn't necessarily mean sitting passively in front of a painting for an excruciatingly long time. Just means with attention and without haste. And it can involve drawing, taking notes, discussing, documenting, just actively pursuing what there is to see. From the studies in this field, we know that slow looking comes with an enormous number of benefits, some of which I've listed here. There's too many to go through today, so I'll just highlight these three, and I want to tell you a little bit about how they are important to me in doing botany. So first off, slow looking builds appreciation for complexity. Plants are infinitely more complex than any first impression could ever suggest, and full appreciation of that complexity supports creative research. So for example, last year in our department, two students, Alice Hillier-Wheel and Ella Chesterton, set out to study morphology and anatomy of leaves in pedunculate oaks that flushed early in April, and then the second flush, which flushed in July. And they compared those plants, or leaves, and they found some striking differences. Second flush leaves of July tended to be smaller at fewer lobes, and they often had, as you can see here, 2 palisade layers instead of just the single one in the first flush. All this seems to point towards second flush leaves being more adapted to full sun, whereas first flush leaves resemble shade-adapted leaves a bit more. And by observing closely, they were really able to show that an oak tree is not just a mass of identical leaves, but a much more complex organism. I'm pleased to say that Ella and Alice are both here today, so make sure you talk to them about their projects. They're really fantastic. Secondly, slow looking shifts your perspective. It allows you to see the plant from the perspective of the plant. And this is something that I really try and emphasize in our plant form and physiology module. Edgehill has 4-hour teaching blocks that lends themselves really well to slow-looking activities. So instead of me just going on for 50 minutes about wood anatomy to the students, what we can do is we can go out on site and take our own tree course. We had a wonderful afternoon the last couple of years at the World Museum looking at the timber collection. And then what we can do with all the wood that we collect is go back into the lab, do a bit of polishing and histology, and have the world of wood anatomy and tree rings revealed to us. Finally then, slow looking supports your mental health. We already know that time spent in nature benefits our mental health and physical well-being, but when I first started organizing nature journaling, art-making workshops in the States 2 years ago, I noticed that slow looking adds yet another layer of those benefits to spending time with nature. And ever since then, facilitating these workshops is one of my favorite things to do, and I'm always looking out for new collaborations. In them, we spend time looking closely at plants and then creatively responding to all of them. And it's so wonderful to witness all of the deep conversations that these objects sparks and that people have with each other around these natural objects, and also the astonishing variety of creative responses in various media that people make. So let me just conclude by saying that the effects of slow looking go far beyond just these three individual benefits that I've mentioned. Ultimately, the combined effects of slow looking help us opening our minds to the world, and they help us truly appreciate and grasp the world's biodiversity in as many ways. Just to briefly return to the beginning of my talk, I think addressing or slow looking might be one of the most important tools that we have in addressing our biodiversity crisis. It is because of slow looking that we still have Franklinia with us today. In other words, there is nothing old-fashioned about being an old-fashioned contemplative biologist. It isn't right, really, to juxtapose slow looking with empiricism, as we've seen at the beginning of the talk is frequently done. Slow looking absolutely supports modern science and aligns with many of the values of the modern zeitgeist. And we just need an occasional reminder to sit down and spend time with the plants that we love. And on that timeless note, I'd like to leave you with Goethe's reflection on his botanical journey. He wrote, "I cannot tell you how readable the book of nature is becoming for me. My long efforts at deciphering letter by letter have helped me, and now, all of a sudden, they're having their effect, and my quiet joy is inexpressible." Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Kristel. Thank you. That was excellent. Very thought-provoking indeed. Nothing wrong with taking time to slow down. Does anyone have any questions for Kristel at all? Anything at all? Okay, well, thank you very much, then, Kristel. That was lovely.